Welcome. In part one, I spoke about the vital role that ethics, values and principles play in both creating and maintaining a benign, caring and well-functioning society and world. I don't want you to think of them as an abstract moral concept that has some notional importance, but actually a living experience that is vital and enriches all our lives when we encounter their presence in our daily interactions with each other. Without ethical, caring and principled behaviour, our lives are devoid of soul and become dark and meaningless. While it implicitly involves every individual contributing to that state, I reflected the particular importance of all our mainstream institutions demonstrating their own unwavering commitment to them. These include the government and politicians, medicine and science, the corporate and business world, and mainstream and social media. As I record this, we recently had the general election on July the 4th, and so the political circumstances of some of the main protagonists in this video have changed post-election. However, today I want to talk about an event that occurred in the UK Parliament at the beginning of last year when the Conservative government was in power. However, I want to warn you in advance, this is going to run for about 30 minutes. There's going to be a lot of information and I'm going to speak quite rapidly, so we'll be going along at quite a lick. But I think it is important, if you bear with me, in order for you to really assess whether I've made my case, that you listen to all the relevant facts. So come on board for a quick and powerful ride. On January the 11th, 2023, during Prime Minister Questions in the UK Parliament, MP Matt Hancock made an accusation that referred to fellow Conservative MP Andrew Bridgen promulgating anti-Semitic, anti-vax and anti-scientific theories earlier that day on Twitter. In my opinion, the accusation and specific claims that were made and targeted at Mr Bridgen by Mr Hancock and the Prime Minister were either misapplied or wrong, and what followed was a miscarriage of justice. Before we look in more depth at why and how I come to that conclusion, I think it is helpful to have a bit more background to what led up to that day. So I invite you to listen carefully to what we need to consider and know. Towards the end of 2022, Mr Bridgen, who has a degree in biological sciences and therefore one of the few MPs able to meaningfully read scientific papers, became increasingly concerned about the safety and efficacy of the COVID-19 vaccines. This largely resulted from him both examining published scientific data as well as listening to a number of eminent scientists, doctors and leaders in their field who were also expressing concerns about aspects of the COVID response, including the safety and efficacy of the vaccines. Many of these professionals had met with a response that included denigrating them and censoring their views and concerns on social media. They also experienced attempts to stop them using therapeutic protocols that in their own medical opinion best serve their patients, and some were threatened with being investigated by their medical boards and losing their license to practice if they continued. This is and was quite incredible and a huge red flag ethically and functionally, because without any explanation, it turned on its head accepted long-established practice prior to COVID. That as a doctor you use your own autonomy to decide medically what best serves your patient's needs. Further, that the scientific method expects, assumes and encourages challenge and scrutiny to new processes and products on behalf of ensuring demonstrated efficacy and, vitally, patient safety. Nothing unusual, normal standard practice. But suddenly this was not only abandoned, but what replaced it was carried out in what can only be described as a dark, authoritarian and fascistic manner, with no explanation or accountability. Frankly, just totally and incredible, and with the vast majority of the public completely unaware that it was happening to some doctors and the style and manner in which it was being carried out. Additionally, it stands not only at odds with a basic scientific principle that the science is never settled and that debate and challenge is assumed and welcomed, but most disturbingly, with the fundamental precautionary principle in medicine and ethics. This says that when there are signals that indicate something may be or is wrong with a product, you act early on the side of caution and suspend the use of it and withdraw it while it is being further investigated. This had regularly happened previously in medicine and could be said to be a normalized and accepted approach with the purpose of supporting good and safe practice. In the case of the COVID-19 vaccines, this did not happen. Why not? Mr. Hancock was the health minister between 2018 and 2021 and was in charge of the health department for the first 15 months of the COVID response, including overseeing the first 6 months of the vaccine rollout. Rishi Sunak was Chancellor of the Exchequer from February 2020 until July 2022. So we see roles for both Mr. Hancock and Sunak in the governmental culture, attitude and rollout of measures in key periods of the pandemic. Now let's move forward in time to October 2022, where we see Mr. Bridgen as the principal speaker in a parliamentary held debate in Westminster Hall, brought about after a petition of more than 100,000 e-signatures from the public concerning the safety of the COVID vaccines. Only a handful of MPs attended. Not surprising, because already it was well established and apparent that nobody in Parliament apart from a tiny handful of MPs wanted to take on board what he had to say and what evidence he supplied. They in fact were completely closed to it. Now for what that tweet of Mr. Bridgen's on January the 11th contained. It had a link to an article from an Israeli PhD, a doctor of criminology and sociology, concerning data and a graph about deaths and other adverse reactions linked to COVID vaccines. The graph was released by the USA's main public health and safety agency, the CDC, and showed the volume of reported medical harms associated with the COVID-19 vaccines. It also included Mr. Bridgen reporting a comment made to him by a respected medic, which went as follows. As one consultant cardiologist said to me, this is the biggest crime against humanity since the Holocaust. Now let's find out exactly what Mr. Hancock stood up and said in Prime Minister Questions on that day in early January 2023, and I quote, "Does the Prime Minister agree with me that the disgusting anti-Semitic, anti-vax conspiracy theories that have been promulgated online this morning are not only deeply offensive, but anti-scientific and have no place in this House or in our wider society?" He was, of course, referring to Mr. Bridgen's tweet earlier that morning. The Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, stood up and followed with, "Well, can I join with my right honourable friend in completely condemning those types of comments that we saw this morning in the strongest possible terms. Obviously, it is utterly unacceptable to make linkages and use language like that, and I'm determined that the scourge of anti-Semitism is eradicated. It has absolutely no place in our society. And I know that the previous few years have been challenging for the Jewish community, and I never want them to experience anything like that ever again." Following this event, Mr. Bridgen had the Tory whip removed and was investigated for his remarks and conduct, subsequently being expelled from the party a couple of months later. However, interestingly, 25 Israeli PhDs independently sent an open letter to the PM calling upon him to withdraw his claims that Mr. Bridgen's comments in the tweet were anti-Semitic. In it they said, "Aside from the fact that Mr. Bridgen was clearly reporting the words of someone else, the word since does not in any way imply equivalence to the events of the Holocaust. For that and other reasons, the tweet is not anti-Semitic. Furthermore," they said, "it seems that you and others have seized upon the opportunity to raise the issue of anti-Semitism in order to limit the free speech of those who raise legitimate concerns about the efficacy and safety of these COVID vaccines. Weaponization of the important issue of anti-Semitism for these purposes is particularly objectionable and disrespectful towards its victims." Well, pretty extraordinary, I would say, to be that direct and blunt to a British PM and indicative of their outrage at the inappropriateness and misattribution of what Mr. Sunak had said. So those are the bare bones. Now let's dig into this, examine the claims, the behaviour involved, and, importantly, the overall ethics. Our first port of call is the accusation and claim that Mr. Bridgen's theories were anti-Semitic in what he tweeted. This is a very serious accusation to make and direct at somebody, and you would and should expect that it was backed up by an explanation from the claimants, in this case Mr. Hancock and the Prime Minister, of exactly what in the tweet they were so certain was anti-Semitic. Yet if there is a report of them giving a specific explanation, I have not personally come across it. The simple dictionary definition of anti-Semitism is hostile to or prejudiced against Jewish people. So that clearly doesn't seem to fit in what Mr. Bridgen said in his tweet and what was in it. A more comprehensive definition, however, that has become more widely accepted includes the perception of demeaning, diminishing or belittling the Holocaust. In an article on the BBC News site on January 11, 2023, titled Andrew Bridgen suspended as Tory MP over COVID-19 comments, the opening line of the article began by indicating he had been suspended for spreading misinformation about COVID vaccination. Then in the next sentence it went on to say he'd posted a tweet that compared vaccines to the Holocaust. Further on, it reported the Tory Chief Whip, Simon Hart, said the comments had crossed a line and caused great offence, while former Vaccines Minister for a part of the pandemic, Nadine Zahawi, was reported to say any comparison made to the Holocaust is completely inappropriate, belittling one of the greatest horrors ever committed by humanity. Well, now we maybe have some potential reference as to what Mr. Hancock and the Prime Minister meant by the term anti-Semitic. But was it anti-Semitic? By what criteria do you assess or judge that? Is it in part linked to the view that the COVID-19 vaccine was and is a benign, wonderful product that saved many lives, and therefore by making a comparison of it to the Holocaust, it demeans both the vaccine and that terrible event? Or is it that some people in the world take the view that irrespective of the event, you cannot relate or compare the Holocaust to any other situation without demeaning or minimizing it? Personally, while I literally understand that view, I don't agree with it and think it is a misplaced form of morality and actually unhelpful when applied in a total and absolute manner. Surely the purpose of these terrible events in human history is to learn from them and not repeat them. The marker is certainly that we treat them with the utmost respect they need and deserve, but it doesn't, in my view, serve humanity for them to be totally off limits to mention. Ultimately, that has to be surely counterproductive, misplaced, and actually a bit irrational to shut people down and assume that event is automatically minimized by people mentioning it or using it as a gauge. So the relevant rebuttal of those who defend the label anti-Semitic is that you're entitled to use the Holocaust as a gauge when you are, of course, duly sufficiently respectful in referring to it, which in this tweet is provided by the word since. The exact point, there's 25 Israeli PhDs made in their letter to Rishi Sunak. So in summary, I do not see that the term anti-Semitic was either justified or proven. Let's move to the lesser but very public calling out of Mr. Bridgen's tweet as promulgating anti-vaxxer theories. In my view, this term has become one of a number of silly playground names and labels that have become weaponized during the pandemic. Unfortunately, it is often used as a means of demonstrating disapproval and dismissal of anyone who the accuser doesn't see as fitting into their view or paradigm around vaccines. It comes across as certain of its correctness and implicitly that the accused are doing something wrong and therefore worthy of criticism and exclusion. However, it conveniently forgets to say anything about the core medical ethics of bodily autonomy and informed consent, or the long-established scientific position of being able to ask questions re safety legitimately. These are a part of what the person who is asking questions or decides perhaps not to take a particular vaccine is entitled to ask and do, and in the previously normal world before the pandemic was accepted as normal and good ethical practice. Therefore, in my opinion, when used in such an opportunistic and accusing manner, the label of anti-vaxxer is often arrogant, entitled, disrespectful, and quite frankly, inappropriate and ethically wrong. I also want to mention and say something about the following. In relation to the use of this term, anti-vaxxer, there was a strong implication through the public narrative that everybody should take the vaccine because by doing so, they were keeping the whole group safe. If someone is not willing to, the implication being they're selfish and endangering the lives of others. While this undoubtedly is an appealing ethical argument for some people, in my view, it could only begin to be justified under the following strict and stringent conditions. One of those is that the product being promoted has unequivocally been proven to be safe over a long period of time and accepted as so by not only a wide group of scientists and medics, but also other people in different industries who are all free from any skin in the game or conflicts of interest. 2. That there are not equal, safer, or already existing better therapeutic alternatives available in the pharmaceutical or nutraceutical industries. And 3, that those who are proposing mandating a product have demonstrated you can absolutely trust their integrity. In my view, unfortunately, we learned over time that none of these applied to the COVID-19 vaccines. Also, in looking at the pharmaceutical industry over time, their record is one of being fined not millions, but billions of pounds over the years for hiding or underrepresenting harms in trials of a new product and therefore knowingly let human beings who took the product be harmed and unfortunately and terribly in some cases die. With the COVID-19 vaccines, the claim was that it was and had been sufficiently tested and proven to be safe and effective. However, as time went by and medical professionals, scientists and researchers around the world began looking more closely themselves at the data provided by some of the vaccine manufacturers around their testing of their COVID-19 vaccine, they found that it had described a far from either safe or effective product, certainly one that needed immediate closer examination. The overall point that I believe we should be considering in relation to using a term like anti-vaxxer and weaponizing it against people we consider are threatening to us or not doing what we consider right is the following. However much we believe in a course of action or that the safety of our health depends on certain products, we should always consider and retain a respect for other people's views and in this case their right to decide for themselves what they put into their bodies. Not only as a sound human and medical ethical stance, but one that is realistic about and acts as an insurance against the danger of trusting that all human beings are acting and behaving from a benign and beneficent position. Because, as we're all too familiar with in these strange times and from the past, they aren't. So regarding Mr. Hancock's claim that Mr. Bridgen's theories were anti-vaxxer, I would also call that label overall misleading and unproven in the sense of the spirit of it. For used in the way and the style it was delivered, it misdirects the listener and excludes the listener from knowing and understanding that the whole entire context around vaccination is that it is ethically legitimate for us all to evaluate and decide for ourselves on the basis of full and informed knowledge and consent, and our own innate and democratic right to choose what we put into our bodies. So now we come to the final label that Mr. Hancock accused Mr. Bridgen's tweet of being, which was anti-scientific. Once again, this is a very easy claim to make and sounds authoritative and a little superior, but where is the justification and substance for it? Did Mr. Hancock state in detail what was Not scientific? Not to my knowledge. It goes without saying that differences of opinion about the science go on all the time amongst scientists and researchers. But it doesn't mean because you don't agree with a differing view or opinion that ipso facto they are indisputably anti-scientific because you say they are. What we do know is that all the way through his presentation of concern to public, to rather the Parliament about the pandemic response and the COVID-19 vaccine, Mr. Bridgen reported that he took great care to follow the scientific principle of checking and referencing all his data. He made it available in a written form to his fellow MPs and was supported in this endeavour by knowledgeable medical professionals. This makes sense not just because he has a science background, but because he knew it was certain that the data would be closely scrutinised for accuracy. Therefore, that demonstrates to me he was being scientific and being as diligent and secure as he could on behalf of both us, his fellow MPs, and himself. So for me, anti-scientific is also not proven. So we've just looked at the three official main terms that Matt Hancock accused Mr. Bridgen of in Parliament, and one of which the PM Rishi Sunak supported. And I've given my reasons as to why I think all three are misapplied or wrong. Now, in conclusion, let me attempt to evaluate the ethics associated with this particular event. In selecting this particular one to speak about, the importance of ethics in our mainstream organisations, clearly demonstrating their commitment to them, I did so on this basis. That it has sat with me for over a year that what Mr. Bridgen experienced was deeply and totally unfair and actually a miscarriage of justice. You may ask, how are we to know for sure? Because clearly we're in a situation where one side says one thing while the other says the opposite. Well, the answer is that we have to evaluate it as objectively as possible to the best of our ability, looking at what we know about the facts and also the behaviour shown. And the likely biggest elephant for me in the room on which everything hinges that aids our appraisal is the evidence around the safety of the vaccine and its efficacy. Currently, we're seeing a common thread in many countries in the face of a mountain of growing evidence from their own and other doctors and scientists around the world that the vaccines are neither safe or effective. However, these politicians and their mainstream health agencies and advisors are often doubling down and willfully avoiding the implications of that evidence that is staring them in the face. In psychological terms, it is obvious what is likely to be accounting for this behaviour and response. They've dug a huge hole for themselves and painted themselves in a corner in their support for these vaccines and telling us repeatedly they were safe and effective. Additionally, using coercive behaviour at times in getting the population to take them and supporting or encouraging the censoring and shutting down of individuals legitimately questioning or challenging it, including, importantly, respected medics and scientists. That's a key sign. So it is too overwhelming psychologically for them to take on board their part and responsibility in pushing a product down our throats that has harmed so many people. What we can appraise about the respective ethics of Andrew Bridgen is this, in my view. He showed the highest personal and professional courage and commitment to ethics in persistently trying to raise the alarm amongst his colleagues about the emerging harms of the COVID-19 vaccines. In doing so at tremendous cost to his professional career and personal life. With the exception of a handful of MPs, nobody was willing to listen or take on board the sourced scientific data he made available to them to support his claims. And as a result, he became isolated and a pariah amongst his colleagues, and arguably could be spoken of as a whistleblower who suffered scapegoating and gaslighting. However, he never gave up and attracted ongoing support from a number of doctors and scientists. He paid the ultimate cost in a very public way. In terms of the ethics of Rishi Sunak in his role as Prime Minister supporting the claim of Mr. Bridgen's tweet promulgating anti-Semitic theories, I refer to those 25 Israeli PhDs writing an open letter to him and accusing him of weaponizing the term anti-Semitic in a completely inappropriate way. Matt Hancock was the main accuser of Andrew Bridgen, and I've already outlined that I don't see that his claims of anti-Semitic, anti-vax and anti-scientific were substantiated. What we do know is that both Mr. Sunak and Mr. Hancock were key figures at the time in the Conservative government that responded and had to deal with COVID-19. We cannot know for sure what motivated their accusations against Mr. Bridgen on January 11, 2023, but what we can reasonably assert is that he was a thorn in the side of an official narrative in which in key moments they both had an investment and a significant part to play. That he was providing and producing data that was very threatening to their stance and position about the COVID response in general, but most importantly the key instrument of that response, the COVID-19 vaccines. Interestingly and tellingly, Mr. Bridgen reported that in a meeting he had with a party in January 2023 to explain and substantiate his position, he was told that currently there was no political appetite for his views on the vaccine. However, that in 20 years' time there may well be, and that probably he was going to be proven right then. However, in the meantime, he was reminded that he was taking on the most powerful, vested interest in the world, and with all the personal risks to himself that that would entail. Taken at face value, that explains and says a lot, and is equally highly disturbing in all that it implies. It may not be easy to, but it seems to me that we are in a moment of time where it is vital that ordinary people like you and I speak up and name specifically out loud in society when they see and experience those basic core ethics of democracy and love being breached. For currently this is often going unremarked when there are blatant transgressions by individuals or our mainstream institutions. It does need to be done by all of us, and it needs to be spoken about on the radio, the TV, social media, and to our MPs. For if we want a world of goodness, love, and the core values of democracy, we all need to speak up, out loud, and gently and unmovingly insist on it. Thank you for listening to what is a very long and intense and detailed video. And please hit the subscribe button if you want to automatically be informed of future videos by me. I'll put links down below to a number of websites that if you're interested you can research in relation to scientific data associated with the pandemic and the COVID vaccines. Next time there's going to be a change of theme, and I'm going to do the first in a line of videos that get information about romantic relationships, which is the other side of this YouTube channel and my work. Until then, bye bye for now.